Imagine a farmer who abandons his tractor, puts the plow in the barn, and never touches it again, who stops pulling weeds, stops adding fertilizer, gives up pesticides, and watches his neighbors tap their temples. And then this farmer harvests a rice crop that matches the output of the most intensive modern operations. This isn't a fairy tale or a marketing trick. This is the real story of a real man named Masanobu Fukuoka, a Japanese microbiologist who in 1938 experienced a mystical awakening at a harbor dock in Yokohama and made the strangest decision in the history of world agriculture. He decided to stop doing anything, literally. Today I'll tell you about the man who spent 60 years proving that the less you do on a farm, the better it works. We'll break down his 4 principles, which contradict everything taught in agronomy universities. I'll show you how clay balls the size of a cherry replace an entire tractor with a seed drill. And at the end of the video, I'll reveal Fukuoka's most paradoxical conclusion, which flips the entire logic of modern agriculture on its head. Stay to the end and subscribe to the channel because Fukuoka's method can literally free you from half the work in your garden and get you better results than you're getting now. First, let's establish who this man was and why his words are worth listening to. Masanobu Fukuoka was born in 1913 on the island of Shikoku in Japan into a farming family, but he didn't stay on the land right away. He trained as a microbiologist, specialized in phytopathology, the science of plant diseases, and worked in government laboratories studying microorganisms. He was a scientist in the most classical sense, a man in a white coat with a microscope in a sterile environment. And it was precisely his scientific background that made his revelation so powerful. Because when Fukuoka at age 25 experienced his famous awakening, when he suddenly saw that nature needs no help from humans to work perfectly, he didn't just feel it intuitively. He began to test it, rigorously, methodically, like a scientist. Over the next 6 decades, his farm on Shikoku Island was a living laboratory where every year he gathered data that confirmed his theory. In 1975, he published the book, The One Straw Revolution, which was translated into dozens of languages and became one of the most influential books in the history of agriculture. It inspired entire movements: permaculture, regenerative farming, natural farming. Bill Mollison, one of the founding fathers of permaculture, directly named Fukuoka as his inspiration. In 1938, the young Fukuoka was working as a plant quarantine inspector in Yokohama. He was ill, exhausted, and at one point lost consciousness and ended up in the hospital with suspected pneumonia. Lying in his hospital room at night, he thought about death and the pointlessness of human effort. At dawn, he walked to the harbor and sat on a cliff above the dock, and suddenly he saw a heron flying over the water in the first rays of sunlight. In that moment, by his own account, the fog in his head cleared. He suddenly understood one thing with absolute clarity. Nature needs nothing. It is perfect on its own. Everything humans do to the land, all of it is not improvement but interference. Not helping nature, but fighting it. He quit his laboratory job, returned to his father's farm, and began an experiment that would last his entire life. What happens if I simply stop getting in the way of the land doing its work? The first years were a disaster. He really did stop doing everything at once, and yields collapsed. The orchard trees became overgrown and diseased. The rice paddies produced pitiful results. His father was horrified. Neighbors laughed. Fukuoka nearly gave up, but he kept watching. And gradually he began to understand the difference between 2 concepts: doing nothing as absolute passivity and doing nothing as intelligent minimalism, where you do only what is truly necessary and not one step beyond that. It was this second concept that he developed over the following decades into a coherent system of 4 principles. Fukuoka's system rests on 4 principles, and each one runs counter to what is taught at any agricultural university in the world. Understanding them intellectually isn't difficult, but accepting them psychologically, letting go of the centuries-old belief that land demands hard labor, that's the real challenge. Principle 1. No plowing. Fukuoka completely abandoned the plow entirely. His fields were never plowed in 60 years. Here's why this makes sense scientifically and why it was easy for him to grasp as a microbiologist. Soil is not an inert substrate into which you add nutrients. It's a living ecosystem where trillions of microorganisms, earthworms, fungi, and other organisms work in complex symbiosis. When you plow, you destroy this ecosystem. You flip the layers, killing organisms adapted to living at a specific depth. You tear apart the fungal threads of mycorrhizae that supply plants with nutrients. You destroy the pore structure through which water penetrates deep into the ground. The irony is that plowing is what makes further plowing mandatory. Disturbed soil compacts, loses structure, forms a crust, and then it seems like you can't get by without the plow. But this is a vicious cycle created by plowing itself. Soil that is never plowed maintains its structure, stays loose, riddled with worm channels and root paths. It simply doesn't need a plow. Principle 2, no chemical fertilizers and no compost. This is the most provocative principle and requires the most detailed explanation. Fukuoka wasn't saying plants don't need nutrients. He was saying that healthy soil provides plants with everything they need on its own if you don't interfere. The key element of his system is a mulch of rice straw spread across the fields after each harvest, and clover growing as a cover crop between rows of rice and barley. The straw, as it decomposes, returns to the soil everything the rice took from it. The clover fixes nitrogen from the air. This is a closed nutrient cycle requiring no external inputs whatsoever. Principle 3, no weeding. Fukuoka didn't destroy weeds mechanically or with herbicides. He managed them. Clover growing as a dense carpet between crops prevented most weeds from growing because it occupied all available space. The straw mulch on the soil surface prevented weed seeds, which need light, from germinating. Fukuoka said weeds aren't enemies, but a symptom of disturbed soil. Remove the disturbance, create balance, and weeds will retreat to a tolerable level on their own. Principle 4, no pesticides. Healthy plants and healthy soil with rich biodiversity, surrounded by diverse insects, birds, and other organisms, are naturally resistant to pests. Disease and harmful insects are a signal of imbalance, not a random threat to defend against. Remove the imbalance and the problem disappears by itself. One of Fukuoka's most famous and simultaneously most exotic practices is clay seed balls, or in Japanese, tsuchi dango. The idea is so simple it almost seems naive, but it works with striking effectiveness. Fukuoka took seeds of several plant species at once: rice, clover, radish, various vegetables. He soaked them, mixed them with moist clay, and rolled them into balls the size of a cherry or small plum. The balls were dried in the sun and became hard. They could be stored indefinitely. When planting time came, Fukuoka and his helpers simply scattered the balls across the field by hand. No seed drill, no tractor, no precise row seeding. Just spreading the balls evenly across the surface of the straw-covered ground. Why clay? First, it protects seeds from birds and rodents. A pigeon or sparrow can't easily peck through a hard clay ball. A mouse isn't interested in a hard clod of earth. But when rain comes and the clay softens, the seeds find themselves in an ideal position, on the soil surface, in a moist environment, ready to germinate. Second, clay retains moisture around the seeds, giving them the critical start they need in the first days after germinating. Third, when you sow several species in one ball, they germinate together, creating a natural plant community from day one. The clover finds itself immediately next to the rice and begins fixing nitrogen precisely where the young rice seedling needs it. This method was a genuine revelation for specialists in mechanized agriculture who had been trained to believe that precise row seeding with exact spacing between seeds is a prerequisite for good yields. Fukuoka proved this assumption wrong. Nature never sows in rows. Nature scatters seeds chaotically, and plants find their own place. Imitate nature and the plants will do the rest. If clay seed balls are the romantic iconography of Fukuoka's method, rice straw is its true engine. After each rice and barley harvest, Fukuoka spread all the cut straw back onto the field, unbaled, directly over the stubble, in an even layer covering the entire soil surface, and this simple act set off an entire chain of processes. First, straw as mulch retains moisture in the soil. Under the straw layer, soil stays moist even during dry periods. This dramatically reduces the need for irrigation. On the Japanese island of Shikoku, where seasonal rains are uneven, this mattered enormously. Second, straw suppresses weeds. Seeds of most weeds can't germinate in the darkness under a thick layer of mulch. Even those that do germinate can't push through a dense layer of straw. The clover that Fukuoka deliberately seeded as a cover crop additionally occupied the spaces between crop plants, keeping weeds from taking hold. Third, and most important, straw is a food source for soil biology. As it decomposes, it feeds bacteria, fungi, and earthworms. Those organisms in turn process it into humus, increasing the soil's organic matter content. Each year, the soil under the straw mulch became a little richer, a little looser, a little more alive. Over 60 years of no-till farming with constant straw mulching, the soil on Fukuoka's farm transformed into something that made agronomists speechless. Dark, crumbly, alive, riddled with worm channels, smelling like a forest. There's one more aspect of straw in Fukuoka's system that seems almost magical until you understand the mechanism. Fukuoka noticed that the straw from the previous harvest, spread on the field, creates an ideal environment for germinating the seeds of the next crop. Seeds scattered in clay balls across the straw surface, when wet, found their own path down through the mulch layer to the moist soil. This path gave them exactly what they needed: protection from drought and direct sunlight in the early stage, and moisture right at the soil surface. The most obvious question from skeptics was, fine, beautiful philosophy, but what about the yields? If Fukuoka's method produced half of what intensive farming produced, it would be an interesting theory and nothing more. But Fukuoka documented his yields, and the numbers were uncomfortable for his critics. Rice yields on his farm were around 5 to 6 tons per hectare in good years. This nearly matched the average yield in Japan for conventional intensive farming of that era, which was about 5.5 tons per hectare. In other words, doing nothing in the traditional sense, Fukuoka was harvesting as much as his neighbors who were plowing, row seeding, applying fertilizer, spraying pesticides, and doing hard physical labor in their fields year-round. But that's only part of the comparison. When you account for all costs, the difference became enormous. Fukuoka's neighbors spent money on tractor fuel, purchased fertilizer, herbicides and pesticides, irrigation, and hired labor. Fukuoka spent practically nothing. No, literally nothing. Seeds for next year came from the current year's harvest. Straw for mulch was his own from the same field. Clover was seeded once and self-renewed. No external inputs. This meant his net profit per hectare was incomparably higher, with the same gross yields, plus his labor was minimal. On his farm worked several apprentices, students and volunteers from around the world who came to learn, and whom Fukuoka fed and housed. Fukuoka himself was more often found sitting on a hillside, watching his field than working in it. Fukuoka's method applied not only to his rice paddies, but to his mandarin orange orchard. And this is where the story becomes especially revealing. When Fukuoka returned to his father's farm, the orchard had been neglected. Trees that hadn't been tended for several years were overgrown and looked bleak. An ordinary farmer would have started with pruning, treating the trees with fungicides for the diseases that had developed during the years of neglect, and applying fertilizer. Fukuoka did something different. He released the orchard into a near-free state. Minimal shaping pruning, just enough so the trees wouldn't shade each other. Under the trees, he seeded clover, which became a living mulch and nitrogen source. On the soil surface beneath the canopy, he laid mulch from organic materials. No pesticides, no fungicides. After a few years, neighboring farmers couldn't believe their eyes. Fukuoka's trees were healthy, producing abundant fruit, and looked more alive and vigorous than the carefully tended, sprayed, and fertilized trees of his neighbors. The soil beneath them was darker, looser, full of worms. The insects his neighbors were killing with pesticides existed in balance on Fukuoka's farm. Predatory insects controlled harmful ones, and no species reached a level where it could cause significant damage. This orchard became a living demonstration of his theory. When you create conditions in which nature can work, it works better than humans do. Every pruning, every spraying, every loosening disturbs a balance that nature is trying to restore. Remove the disturbance and equilibrium establishes itself. I promised you Fukuoka's most paradoxical conclusion. Here it is. Fukuoka said that his method of do-nothing farming requires more attentive observation than any other approach to agriculture. This is not passivity. This is maximum mindfulness. When you plow, add fertilizer, spray, you're following an algorithm. You're not thinking about what's happening in the soil. You're just doing what's supposed to be done. But when you give up all those tools, when you can't solve a problem with a tractor or chemicals, you are forced to look, really look, to see which plants grow where and why, to understand that a disturbance in one place creates a problem somewhere else, to read the land like a book. Fukuoka said he spent the first 20 years of his experiment learning to see, unlearning to see what textbooks showed him, and learning to see what nature shows. This was the hardest part. Not the physical labor, of which his system required very little, but the intellectual labor of letting go. This is precisely why his method is so hard to simply copy from instructions. The specific practices, straw, clover, clay balls, these are tools. But behind them stands a principle that must be understood. The land knows better. Your task is not to manage the land, but to create conditions in which it can manage itself. Masanobu Fukuoka died in 2008 at the age of 95, never having left his farm on Shikoku. His book, The One Straw Revolution, has been translated into more than 25 languages and continues to inspire farmers around the world. His influence is enormous and wide-ranging. Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, who created permaculture in the 1970s in Australia, directly cited Fukuoka as one of their key inspirations. Fukuoka, in Mollison's words, showed that natural systems can provide humans with food without destroying what creates them. The regenerative farming movement, which is experiencing a genuine boom today, is built on the same principles that Fukuoka was practicing back in the 40s and 50s. Organic farming also borrowed extensively from his experience, though often not in its most radical form. His methods can be applied at any scale. If you have a large farm, the principles of no-till and straw mulching are directly applicable. If you have a small backyard vegetable garden, the principles of cover crops, minimal intervention, and observation work just as well. If you have just a few containers on a balcony, the principle of creating living, biologically rich soil instead of dead substrate into which you add chemical fertilizers, that's Fukuoka too. You can start small. Stop digging up your beds every spring. Leave plant residues in place instead of cleaning them up. Sow clover between rows of your main crops. Cover bare soil with mulch from any organic material, straw, cut grass, shredded leaves. Watch what happens. Resist the urge to intervene at the first sign of a weed or insect. Give the system time to find its balance. You'll find that you're working less, but more importantly, you'll find that you're beginning to understand your piece of land more deeply than ever before. Because when you stop fighting the land and start listening to it, it starts talking back. Masanobu Fukuoka was not a lazy farmer. He was the most attentive farmer of all. The difference between his approach and conventional agriculture is the difference between someone trying to control nature and someone trying to understand it. The first spends endless resources fighting a system that is smarter than them. The second spends time observing and works with the system, using its power instead of opposing it. 60 decades on one field without a plow, without fertilizers, without pesticides, with yields that matched intensive farms. This is not an anecdote or a marketing myth. It is a documented, reproducible result based on a deep understanding of soil biology that Fukuoka acquired as a scientist and confirmed as a farmer. His central message isn't about straw or clay balls. It's that the land is not a problem to be solved. The land is a partner to be trusted. And when you finally stop seeing it as an enemy to be conquered with machinery and chemistry and start seeing it as an ally that knows its business better than you do, something remarkable happens. The land starts working for you. For real. Thank you for watching to the end. If Fukuoka's story inspired you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who is tired of the endless battle in their garden. Because sometimes the best thing you can do for your land is simply step aside and let it do what it does best.